Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, on the first anniversary of the spill, the spring thaw awoke toxic odors, and many Alberton area residents experienced a resurgence in their illness. Before some families gave up and left their homes, they attempted a protest against Montana Rail Link in hopes of gaining publicity and awareness. We now continue with Part 3, Chapter 5. ATSDR. Epigraph. Departments of Public Health have become departments of public reassurance. From the book Inconclusive by Design. In June 1997, Hodges got a letter from Dr. Jeffrey Liebarger, director of the Division of Health Sciences for ATSDR. He explained that ATSDR and the Missoula Health Department had interviewed 682 people from 252 households. They still had no results to share. Hodges had asked ATSDR what would they do for Alberton. Liebarger said the Alberton project might include a community needs assessment, clinical evaluations for the seriously exposed, and environmental health education opportunities for the community. Hodges replied she would discuss it with the coalition. We were still trying to keep the door open, she said, but we were very suspicious. We'd asked them to be involved, and they'd finally responded. So let's see what they can do. That August, she said, ATSDR finally called one day and said, "Oh, we're gonna come." Just prior to the passage of the Superfund law in 1980, industry lobbied to carve out of proposed legislation any hopes for victim compensation. ATSDR, the Agency for Toxic Substances Disease Registry, was a last-minute deal giving a new agency responsibility for monitoring public health at Superfund sites. ATSDR was mandated to establish a registry of serious diseases and illness from toxic exposure, including at Superfund sites, collect information about health effects from toxics, create a list of hazardous areas closed to the public, provide medical care and testing, and conduct health studies. Instead, the EPA routinely gave the agency a fraction of their requested budget. ATSDR had minimal influence on public health matters at Superfund sites, and contaminated communities received little help, a legacy of the President Reagan era. Hodges had reason to be suspicious of ATSDR's upcoming visit, having been indoctrinated against high hopes through Linda King, who co-edited Inconclusive by Design: Waste, Fraud, and Abuse in Federal Environmental Health Research. Inconclusive by Design claimed that the CDC and ATSDR supported intentionally inconclusive studies used by polluters and government officials to mislead local citizens into believing that further measures to prevent toxic exposures are unnecessary. Quite predictably, the authors wrote, no finding of an association between disease and exposure is drawn in studies and assessments which currently cost over $30 million per year in federal tax monies. The inconclusive result of studies are used by polluters and government officials to quell public concerns, they wrote. ATSDR studies often use small sampling populations, which made statistical conclusions predictably inconclusive. In fact, an oft-repeated caveat seemingly built into ATSDR epidemiology was, quote, the methodology used in this study is not capable of either proving or disproving a causal relationship between any specific exposure and any disease. The authors said ATSDR also studied communities to death without making recommendations for treatment or relocation. ATSDR fulfilled Chemical Corporation's desires for the agency, a government stamp of approval on findings of no cause and effect for claims of illness, death, and economic loss from alleged exposure. ATSDR was also required to keep registries of exposed populations. As Alberton victims discovered, ATSDR wouldn't even track victims that moved from Alberton to inform them of study results. As a result of this malfeasance, this 1992 report concluded angry communities had begun to turn ATSDR away and refuse further studies. Said one resident of a contaminated community in Maine, I don't think ATSDR is in there for the people. They seem to be in there to prove that there's no effect or that you can't prove it. This was the reputation of the agency that local and state health officials assured Alberton victims would investigate health concerns. Hodges found another informant in Barbara Miller of Kellogg, Idaho, director of the Silver Valley People's Action Coalition. Miller called her Idaho community leaded, people physically and neurologically damaged by lead exposure from the mining industry in the Bunker Hill mine area. Miller told Hodges no leaded person had ever received medical care or even a diagnosis by ATSDR after 24 years and 80 government studies. Both Miller and King helped inform Hodges of the public backlash against contaminated communities known as popular epidemiology. When the reality of a community's health experience ran counter to corporate and official assurances, citizens became advocates, activists, and even radicals for their cause. The EPA's Chris Weiss was somewhat critical of ATSDR's response in Alberton. ATSDR had a follow-up in mind to their simple survey, but had failed to do baseline clinical testing. ATSDR really didn't do a very thorough job of that, Weiss said. But the response to the Alberton spill was one of the first times ATSDR even went out to a site during an emergency and did anything. They were in their infancy with respect to emergency response. Dr. Cynthia Lewis Younger was later contracted by ATSDR to do a clinical evaluation of Alberton victims in 1999. Lewis Younger had worked for ATSDR from 1991 to 1995. During my entire tenure at ATSDR, I said that we need to come in with the kind of evaluation that I did initially. But this is not ATSDR's fault. Their hands are tied. This is what Congress has required of them. They cannot provide, they have to be very careful about whether or not they provide anything that's perceived to be medical care. In my opinion, they were hampered from doing good public health. ATSDR has never gotten more than 1% of the Superfund budget, she said. Enter ATSDR. ATSDR called Hodges in August and told her representatives were coming to Alberton to talk informally. She had no idea she was far behind the curve. Chris Poulet and Glenn Tucker met with Hodges and others from ACCEH at the Sidetrack Cafe in Alberton. ATSDR was interested in doing a follow-up study and was working on a draft protocol, and Poulet and Tucker sought community input. ACCEH wanted the study to consider other spilled chemicals and all the symptoms they'd been having. Hodges felt the meeting went well. But Beverly Ridenour had friends working for the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, NIOSH, back east. Much to Ridenour's surprise, they told her, "We're mixing your methacholine right now for your study." NIOSH had had the paperwork for months, and ATSDR would be in Alberton to test in a few weeks. Hodges had no inkling that Phase 2 was already a done deal. "ATSDR didn't tell us," she said. And I called Glenn Tucker, and he was speechless. I said, "You've lied to us. This is what we know. What's going on?" It seemed spill victims would have no input on study protocol. Hodges did not trust ATSDR. That September, ATSDR reps held a public meeting to discuss the follow-up study in the Alberton Elementary School lunchroom, in a building that made Hodges and others feel ill. About 45 to 50 people attended, including Ellen Leahy of the Missoula Health Department. Lisa Mosca videotaped. The Missoulian did no coverage. Hodges knew the meeting was crucial because sick residents had turned out, desperate for help 17 months after the spill. Multi-generational resident Dixie Robertson even persuaded some reluctant old-timers to attend. Sean Buckley, who coordinated the new health study, explained that ATSDR was recruiting volunteers. "We are going to be looking at respiratory effects, eye and skin problems, and neurological effects. And we are going to be looking at some specific things that we've heard about from community members, such as fatigue, chronic fatigue syndrome, chemical sensitivity, or multiple chemical sensitivity," he said. Hodges' ears pricked up. This sounded like an ambitious agenda beyond classical chlorine symptoms. Such studies were also important, Buckley said, because little was known about communities being exposed to hazardous chemicals. Alberton was a learning opportunity. The study would include pulmonary function tests, including the methacholine challenge, to assess airway hyperresponsiveness to an irritant. Environmental medicine experts would examine people's skin and eyes. There would also be a health questionnaire. From this, it wasn't clear how neurological symptoms and chemical sensitivity would be addressed. The plan called for an exposed and control groups to each consist of only 150 people, drawing from exposed people only between Alberton city limits and the spill site, on the assumption that this was the area of highest concentration of gas. People immediately questioned the assumption between distance and exposure. The gas settled in pockets, they said. Buckley explained that without air measurements from the day of the spill, the best method was to use proximity to the spill site as a guide to expected exposure. Wayne Wasser spoke up. His young son, Conrad, was exposed down by the mouth of 9 Mile Creek, the edge of the exclusion zone. He's one of the sickest children there are from this exposure, I think, Wasser said. Wasser's black beard shook. I don't know anybody I've heard of who has as many health problems as my child, as Conrad, and he was probably there for 15-20 minutes. I came in 3 days after the spill, Terry Stewart said. I came in on a livestock rescue. I can guarantee $250 to $400 a month on medication. The only thing I took before the spill was a vitamin every day. She lived on the Ponderosa Acres subdivision. Like Conrad Wasser, she would be excluded from the study. Wasser: my hospital bills are up to $40,000 in doctor bills for Conrad. Stewart: it's not just people who are here initially. Wasser: I can't see how you can say that the people closest to it had the most exposure. I think part of it is everybody was affected differently. Some people it affected their eyes, some their lungs, their brains. His black beard jutted assertively. If you're going to do a lung test, you need to be doing it to people who are having the problems, and people who are sick now, not people you did before and just happen to be there and they're not having any problems. Do it to the people who are really having the problems. My son went to the UCSD Medical Center this summer, to the Heart and Lung Center, for 30 hours of testing there to find out what was wrong and why he's dying. Wasser was most concerned about getting his son help. Buckley calmly addressed the rationale of excluding those people living beyond Alberton. The best way to try and get the highest people exposed is how the concentration goes down with distance, he said. Another point, you talked about selecting people for the study based on their symptoms and how bad off they are. To put it bluntly, the study would be blown out of the water by scientific criticism if we did that. Buckley explained that in epidemiological studies, the goal was to determine the association between exposure and disease. It wouldn't be objective to select only on the basis of disease. Hodges quietly observed in the back of the room, knowing that people showed up tonight because they had health problems and they thought they were finally getting some help. But ATSDR's goal was to study. Where does that leave us? Wasser asked. My wife, it didn't affect her lungs, it dried up her eyes. She has no tear ducts left in her eyes. My son has no lungs left. He can't hardly breathe. Someone questioned why no one exposed west of the site was being studied. Without answering, Buckley further explained that this study would follow up only on those people already interviewed 2 weeks after the spill, when their memory was most clear. This meant the 150 people would only be drawn from the original 682, excluding victims like Hodges, who had lived in Alberton but were never contacted for the survey. In truth, the parameter of 150 participants was determined mainly by budget considerations, not science, which Buckley didn't mention at this meeting. A chemically ill man who lived on Petty Creek spoke up. He felt the people living in Alberton might have actually gotten less exposure because they were evacuated faster than some outlying areas. Additionally, he had returned home permanently on April 14 with the exclusion zone reduction, and yet continued to smell chlorine and feel ill from it. I think this concentrating on town is not doing a complete study, he said. Buckley asked how many people at the meeting lived west of Petty Creek. About half the people raised their hands. Then he asked how many had originally been interviewed. Only a few hands went up. Undaunted, Buckley again emphasized the need to follow up on those originally interviewed so to avoid criticism of the study. Another man spoke up. You can do all your criticisms you want. There are people who have documented doctor facts months before they got here. And now all of a sudden they're on pills and gosh darn inhalers and shit they've never had in their life. But we never got interviewed. Nobody talked to us. But we don't count in this thing. It's not that we don't care, Buckley said. And that's why we're proposing that this community have other exams, referring to clinical evaluations that ATSDR's Chris Poulet would talk about. But the obvious exclusiveness of the follow-up study rubbed frayed nerves. These people wanted help, and the many being excluded felt their illness didn't count enough to even be studied. This was largely a meeting of the disgruntled disenfranchised about to be disappointed once again. Tearfully, Dixie Robertson, who had encouraged some of the people to attend this night, explained how sick her father was. I think we need our health issues addressed before you study them, Hodges said from the back of the room, jumping into the forum. They wanted help, not studies, much less studies that excluded most of them. What happens with my child? Wasser demanded. He's almost died twice. He stopped breathing. His teacher's right here, he nodded toward Paul Lodge. He couldn't even give him a report card last year. Couldn't keep him in school, he was so sick. This is a kid in second grade, and you're worried about a health study? Why don't you worry about helping the people in this community and help some of the people who are real sick? I sent him down to USC, came out of our pockets. You know, I didn't get offered any help. Emerald wouldn't pay for it. I asked them for help. They wouldn't help. I'm sorry about your son, Buckley said. Buckley struck Hodges as someone who listened. A man got up and walked out. The main complaint that Wasser and most others in the room had was that their families hadn't been helped the past 17 months. Buckley explained that ATSDR couldn't fix all problems. ATSDR is not a relief or medical care agency. We do not provide direct medical care, he said. Hodges stood up. Why not? She began. The woman who was crying, her baby's in the hospital and her father is dying, both from chemical exposure symptoms. Why can't we have those kind of health problems addressed? Then study us. You're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on this study. Go help that woman with her medical bills. Help Mr. Wasser. I think that would be a much better use of that money at this time. Buckley replied that it's not the statutory authority of ATSDR to provide direct medical treatment. The agency has never done that, he said. It's not set up to do. I know that people have serious problems and are upset and frustrated. Paris Young said there should have been a special clinic set up for victims within days of the spill. That would have been one of your best means of collecting data in a case like this, he said. Is the study already written for this? Yes, the protocol was set, but Buckley assured that people's comments could still modify it. Rick Madge asked, why didn't they consider other chemicals? Despite the lack of test evidence, Buckley said, I'm not absolutely prepared to rule out that there weren't other chemical exposures of significance. The study would also look at all health complaints, including neurological ones, he said. This is not government denial that this was only chlorine. No doubt to his relief, Buckley turned the show over to Chris Poulet from the Denver office, who began a slide presentation to explain ATSDR's health promotion and education approach to environmental health. Part of the program would offer some clinical evaluations and make referrals. If you guys are so concerned about this, Wasser interjected, how come there wasn't anybody here the day that this happened? Poulet wanted to finish his slides and answer questions later. The crowd wanted to unload 17 months of frustration. A man in the back asked why no government agency had been allowed in for 3 days, and suddenly many people at once began talking about this. This crowd hungered for the public hearing they had never been granted. Poulet resumed his slideshow. He explained the program to help set up a CAG, a community advisory group that could conduct a health needs assessment. The CAG would be comprised of affected community members as well as doctors, community leaders, the health department, and ATSDR. The assessment would evaluate the healthcare needs and concerns of the community. Poulet had tripped another trigger. Hodges was concerned about working with the Missoula Health Department. A lot of us would find that very difficult, she said. The health department made the decision that it was safe for us to go home, and we feel betrayed by that. In attendance, Missoula Health Department Director Ellen Leahy remained silent. Leahy later framed her lack of participation as not wanting to debate Hodges. Poulet finished his slides. "I do appreciate you coming here tonight," Hodges said. "It took a lot of guts, because you guys are the first guys to come into this community since the spill. The county didn't come, the state didn't come, EPA didn't come. Nobody else would come." Some people in the audience seemed interested in seeing a medical specialist, and Poulet said the health evaluation would help people find out where to go with referrals. Wasser: "Where to go isn't around here, because the doctors in this town are all bought off by Dennis Washington." The audience laughed and someone clapped. Rick Madge: "I will say it's amazing, absolutely amazing, how you can go to another state and be given a diagnosis without really saying much about what happened to you, and they peg it. You go into Missoula and they're like, 'Oh, you're fine.'" Man in audience: "Or they don't know." Katina Madge: "Or you're crazy." Beverly Ridenauer: "Here's another inhaler. Go home. You're fine. If you need an inhaler to go home, then you're not fine." After more give and take, Hodges said, "Well, you had a big crowd tonight, but you lost half of it." Many people had left the room. To Hodges, Buckley seemed sincere about looking into the issue of the cressolate and chlorinated compounds, and ATSDR had said the next study would look at neurological symptoms and chemical sensitivity. But she was nothing by now if not cynical, and the reason so many people had walked out early was the obvious dead end at getting any immediate, meaningful help. On top of that, most attendees wouldn't even be included in the next study, which felt like a denial that their suffering mattered. Hodges had felt encouraged that Buckley didn't personally rule out exposure to other chemicals, but wondered if he just said that to stop people from lynching him, because she thought Buckley afraid of their venting that night. For an ATSDR rep, he had made a huge statement. "When Sean Buckley came in from ATSDR, he was our first real human contact with them," Hodges recalled. "And he said, 'You know, back in Atlanta, you're considered the X-Files, because all this stuff you're telling us about does not happen with chlorine.'" But Hodges' hopes quickly faded. ATSDR made no major protocol changes to the follow-up study. No chemical but chlorine was considered. "I think we felt totally and utterly betrayed," Hodges said ultimately of that meeting, "because especially the old-timers Dixie Robertson had convinced to come. Completely, because they didn't listen to us. Once again, I felt used. I never got a report from Sean Buckley." She felt ATSDR worked their agenda and only pretended to seek community input. "These bastards have come to town and they have put on their dog and pony show, and they did not care about one thing we had to say," Hodges said. In October, 2 weeks before the testing, Buckley still hadn't rounded up 150 volunteers, emailing Hodges that ATSDR had difficulty contacting some eligible people. Many had moved, and ATSDR had not kept tabs. Buckley requested her help. Once again, an ATSDR study risked being inconclusive by design. Hodges was angry. ATSDR had responded to little of her requests, and now they needed her because they hadn't done their job. Along with many others who attended the ATSDR meeting, the Hodges, Chalmers, Madge, Young, Robertson, Lodge, Ridenauer, Wasser, and Stewart households were all ineligible for the Phase 2 study. Even Deb Griffin, who still lived in Alberton and had participated in Phase 1, was not contacted. Hodges wouldn't have participated now anyway. Hodges wrote Buckley back that they were insulted to be studied again without consideration for the other chemicals. Attaching the letters Montana DEQ's Ellerhoff had written about Plum Creek and the electric co-op meter readers. "It is obscene in the eyes of this community," she wrote, "that our federal government would spend $300,000 to study us," Hodges and Griffin's estimation, "and do nothing to alleviate the pain and suffering of our children." She quoted from CERCLA and the ATSDR mandate. "Answer these questions," she wrote. Why were people still smelling chemicals and feeling ill, even far from the site? Why were people who lived outside the evacuation zone sick? How could people remediate homes that made them sick? Why did ATSDR ask for community input only after the contract for testing was a sealed deal? Hodges never heard from or about ATSDR epidemiologist Sean Buckley again, except that he had become ill and eventually took leave from the agency. She couldn't help but wonder about anyone who got sick after visiting Alberton. In addition to limiting the study to original Phase 1 participants and those people living closest to the spill site, only people aged 25 to 65 were eligible. One rationale was that, quote, young children can't take breathing tests, apparently referring to anyone under the age of 25. The ATSDR testing in mid-October would mainly examine lung function, with a pulmonary function test to measure breathing capacity and a methacholine bronchial challenge test, a measurement of hyperresponsiveness. People would also receive a short visual exam of their skin and eyes. A health questionnaire would also be given. Original protocol had no mention of testing for multiple chemical sensitivity or neurological symptoms. The final protocol for the Phase 2 study listed the additional objective of measuring any increased prevalence of neurological problems. It said this arose out of concerns and anecdotal reports from the community. The so-called neurological testing was limited to a series of 16 questions used to screen for possible neurological problems and validated in field trials against the results of neurobehavioral test batteries, such as the actual tests done by Dr. Kilburn. ATSDR claimed to have successfully done this so-called test once before. Listed as a study limitation, the budget allowed only 300 pulmonary function and methacholine challenge tests, half for the control subjects. Funding limitations, therefore, drove the rationale to exclude so many affected people, not science. The protocol assured statistical confidence in the sample size, yet already admitted that the sample size would, quote, limit the study's power to detect any relatively weak but still positive and medically significant association between exposure and respiratory problems. ATSDR called this a follow-up study, the purpose to determine if people studied initially after the spill suffered long-term health effects. But the Phase 1 health survey lacked baseline tests. In other words, this was not truly a follow-up study, and this threw into question the whole rationale for excluding other exposed victims, apart from the overriding budgetary reasons. Having severely drained the pool from which to choose, ATSDR ironically encouraged people to volunteer because poor participation, quote, can cause the study results to lack meaning. In addition to this self-limiting design of the volunteer pool, ATSDR faced significant skepticism by the spill victims. After the testing, ATSDR bemoaned that they didn't even get 150 volunteers. While Hodges awaited results of the ATSDR health survey, in the spring of 1997, Dr. K. Kilburn made available a draft paper on his Alberton study that became a chapter in his 1998 book, Chemical Brain Injury. Kilburn studied 97 residents, the majority within 7 weeks after exposure. He concluded from his battery of neurological tests, it appears that chlorine damages the central nervous system. Kilburn's past studies had suggested continuing deterioration, and he planned a follow-up study. Additionally, subjects had increased respiratory symptoms. 70% had bronchoconstriction. None of Kilburn's study results were reported in the Missoulian. For Hodges and others, Kilburn verified what they had long suspected. Their exposure had caused brain damage. That autumn, Deb Griffin finally escaped Alberton. Her sensitivity to ubiquitous consumer chemicals was a big factor in why she couldn't work, at least at Costco. Meanwhile, her husband Dana stopped working because of spill-related eye problems. It was a fight every day to feed our children, Deb said. The financial outlook brightened when Dana accepted a new job in Billings. Living in Alberton made her symptoms worse, and she noted some improvement after moving. For sick residents who chose to remain behind, she felt, their home is their sanctuary, and they're afraid of losing that sanctuary, she said. But if you really don't know if it's safe anymore, it's not your sanctuary. Griffin's house was listed in late 1997 at $114,900. She got a laugh at reading the copy in the Realtor magazine. Hot property! This is truly a hot property, it said. When they put their home on the market, Griffin said, we made sure that we disclosed that there was a chemical spill and that, as far as I'm concerned, nobody knows the long-term health effects. The Griffin House, built in 1995, sold at a loss. Aggressively marketed as a dream house, the ranch-style home sat in the listings for over half a year. The realtor felt it was directly a result of the spill that the property dropped in price. In a spill-depressed market, sellers were told to wait a few years. That was no small thing for someone who felt they lived in a toxic environment, wanted to move, and hoped to get the value back they had put into their house. Just wait a few years. Realtors noted that Alberton property values decreased while the Missoula area began a real estate boom in the early 1990s that continued into the next century. Alberton landlords also had difficulty renting out. Missoula realtor Carl Priesing reported, "It is my opinion that all Alberton area property owners have suffered 20 to 35% decreases in value," he said. If so, the spill had the effect of a mini Milwaukee shutdown on Alberton, another effect that went untracked. Griffin's departure created a personal void for Hodges and a hole in everyday support for the coalition. "I've hugged too many women goodbye, and my friends are all gone from Alberton," Hodges said in 1998. "They completely changed our town." But Griffin remained a long-distance friend. By Lisa Mosca's later count, 33 families comprising 103 people left their Alberton area homes for 1 year or more following the spill, most leaving permanently. No government agency tracked spill-related relocations. Hodges began working closely with Mosca. In addition to making her environmental studies thesis a video documentary about the Alberton spill, Mosca taped the ATSDR meeting, in part to maintain a public record on behalf of ACCEH. Hodges quickly saw that she had a sincere interest in helping spill victims. "We changed our focus from the crisis management every day of the people to looking at the more long-term goals of what we could accomplish for the people," Hodges said. With Mosca's encouragement, Hodges set her sights on Congress, hoping to work with the politicians to make them understand you've got to have a safety net for chemical injury, she said. And it's not ATSDR, and it's not the corporation. We weren't helping. We weren't saving anybody. So the only thing we could do is look at the bigger picture and see if we could get the laws changed. If not for us, at least for other people, and try to get people to recognize what happened here. The Alberton X-File. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. 19 months after the Alberton derailment and toxic chemical spill, a Montana Rail Link runaway train running full speed downriver backwards threatens to derail near or in Missoula. And emergency authorities have no idea what cargo the train carries. Until then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.